this video, I want to talk to you about effects returns, and specifically we're going to be dealing today with Reverb. Now, Reverb is an incredibly important tool that, if used correctly, can really help establish this sense of a convincing physical space for all of your elements to belong in. Now, if you imagine that you're listening to a band play, for example, in a hall of some sort, the reverberation of the hall will be consistent. The sound of the band will be consistent. Everything will sound as if it's emanating from the same place. Now, when we're creating electronic music, we're pulling in sounds and samples and MIDI parts and plugins, and often all of them have some form of reverberation on. And it's not reverb that we're controlling. And as a consequence, you can end up with a mix that sounds really disparate and really quite muddled. And what's happening to your brain is telling you that this sound is being generated from this space and this one from another space. And you start putting that together over the course of 25, 30, 40 parts. And, it's a potential recipe for some confusion from the listener's perspective. So what I like to do with my mixes is I will use multiple reverbs, but I try to ensure that ultimately the sound that you're listening to when you're listening to the track as a whole feels like it generates from some kind of a consistent space. So what is reverb exactly? Well, it's kind of defined as a persistence of sound or an echo that happens after an initial sound is produced. The way that I tend to use it in my tracks is to place it on effects returns. And you can see these effects returns down at the bottom right hand of the screen here in Ableton. What that means is I'm not placing reverbs on each individual channel. And there's a really important reason why I don't want to do that. The main reason is really the CPU. And the CPU meaning the computer processing unit power. Now, reverb is very labour intensive when it comes to draining energy from your computer's RAM. So it makes sense to minimise the instances of reverb as much as possible. The other real benefit of putting them on effects returns is it gives you this kind of consistency. Also, if you're sending multiple different sounds through a singular reverb, you can get some really kind of pleasing frequencies where, the frequencies are sort of gelling together and helping the track sort of glue together a little bit better. So in order to do that, we place a reverb, and I have a Valhalla vintage verb here on the first instance of our effects returns. And if we go into an individual sound here or a bus, we can send some of this dry signal from our sound directly into one of these effects returns. It's good to have these set to pre-mode, and that way you can independently control the level of the reverb from the amount of dry signal that's going into it. So the amount of signal that's going into it is controlled independently of the volume here. And you can change the pre or post mode by simply clicking on that particular box. So let's just have a listen to the track, or these rhythm parts from this track as I have them, and then we'll have a quick look at the way that some of these reverbs are being used and how it's all kind of knitting together. So this is our rhythm track. Now, one of the things that's important to realise with reverb is that the longer the reverb is, the more your sound effectively feels like it's set back in the mix. And really that's just attributed to this idea that you're creating a very large space for the sound to belong in, and that long reverb tail will almost on a Z axis or a Z axis, it will make it feel as if it's set back from the really, really upfront and drier sounds. And when you're actually mapping out the way that all of your sounds come together in a mix, that Z-axis is a really important one to think about. And Reverb's a great tool to be able to offset things and just sort of set them back from the very, very front of the mix. So what we have here is we actually have 4 different reverbs. I'm going to take that one off because that one isn't being used at the moment. And they're all being used for a slightly different effect. So if we listen to the first one here, you know, it's quite a long reverb. It's being used more as a sort of spot reverb on a couple of claps. Let's hear it with the live drums. And then there's another long reverb here which is being used as a spot reverb. And this is the big cavernous sound that you're hearing just on that snare drum. And that's deliberately like creating this sort of big sense of space within the mix. Now you'll also notice on this that down at the bottom here with our little effects chain, there are a couple of really important things that I'm working with. And generally speaking, when you add reverb onto a sound, you can bring in all kinds of frequencies that you might have worked very carefully to avoid in your EQ work on your dry signal on your individual channel. But by putting on an effect, sometimes you can add some unwanted bottom end and some muddiness. So there's a couple of things that I tend to do to mitigate that. The first is I'll add some kind of processing, and here you can see that I've used Pro Q3 in mid-side mode so that I'm losing some of the bottom end here just in the mono part of the sample, but I'm actually losing a lot more of the stereo content in that bottom end. And what that's doing is it's just giving us a little bit more headroom, and it's avoiding any stereo muddiness happening down at the bottom end. The next thing in the chain here is a utility plugin here which comes with Ableton, and I'm using this purely to mitigate the stereo width of this sound. And this is something that's quite important, which is why I have this instance of Span from Voxengo, which you can download for free from their website, at the end of the chain. What this is showing me, and I've spoken about this in previous tutorials, but this is showing me the relative volume of the stereo and the mono content. And as we see this hit, you'll see that the lighter green colour, or the yellowy colour there, that represents the stereo content of the sound, and then the mono content of the sound is represented by the darker green. And generally it's a really good rule of thumb, as we've looked at in a previous tutorial, to avoid the level of the stereo content exceeding that of the mono content, and that tends to create a kind of out of phase effect which is sort of disorientating on the ear, and it can mean that your mix just dissolves a little bit and it doesn't gel together as well as it should. So what I've done here with the utility plugin is I've just reduced it by about 1/3, that width. It's the only thing I've done with this plugin, is I've just simply reduced the width down so that it's not right at the very edges of the stereo field. And I felt with this particular rhythm section here, let's just listen to that. And the reason that I have narrowed that reverb somewhat is because we have quite a lot of width in this sound anyway, and I didn't want the different reverbs to be clashing with one another. Speaking of different reverbs, let's just have a listen to a reverb used in a different way. So in this way, this is the high reverb. Now this is specifically being used to create some real sizzle to the sound, and also to create some real width, because the original samples that I was using for these high parts are in the main in mono, and they're fairly centered in the mix. So what I wanted to do with this particular instance of the reverb is just to create some stereo width and just some real kind of sizzle to that sound. And you can see with the Q3 here with the EQ plugin, and I could be doing this just with the regular EQ8 within Ableton. So I've taken out a huge amount of anything remotely, even kind of mids and upper mids have almost come out. So this really is just that fizziness for just providing the very, very top end here. The other thing that I've done with this is you can see I've added a compressor. And I've created a bit of a pumping effect here so that this particular type of reverb isn't just washing over the top of the kick and just limiting the amount of headroom that the kick has to really punch through the mix. So I've created a side chain from our main kick. So each time the kick punches, it ducks the level of this particular reverb. As you can see, we're losing about 5 dB each time the kick hits. And the one other type of reverb that I'm using here is actually a gated reverb. And now you can see here from the reverb itself that this is a relatively short reverb. It's a room mode, half a second long, and this is being applied to some of the main drums in the track. Let's just have a listen to that. So you can hear there's some kick, there's some snare and some hats. Now the reason that I'm using this is I quite often find that, as I was saying earlier, because the samples that you use in these tracks have often been generated from all kinds of different sources, and they maybe contain a little bit of reverb of their own, almost without fail, that's the case. So what I'll quite often do with the drums themselves in that instance is I might go into the editing window here and we'll see if we can find some of these snares, for example. And you can see here that with the snares, they're really quite short. There's a few of them that are layered here, but let's just loop this one round. Now, what I've done with this sample earlier on in the processing of it is I've got rid of a lot of the original reverb that came with it. And you can do that really easily just by going into the sample like this. And say you have a long reverb tail, then the quickest way to get rid of it is simply to use, we just toggle that on, we just use these envelope controllers. And if you click on a square at the end of your sample and just drag it backwards, you can see from what's happening in the waveform that it just tightens the waveform up. And that's quite a good technique for getting rid of some reverb and then using something like this gated reverb that I have on these drum sounds to simply unite them in a singular space. And it's quite an effective technique at doing that. Let's just create a longer loop. Take the other reverbs off for a minute so you can hear it a bit more clearly. Now for me that feels like it's kind of knitting together as a drum kit should do. And with the other reverbs in place, now I know all of these reverbs are slightly different and they have a slightly different function, but the drums as a whole, when they're all combined, they're quite wet, but they very much sound like they belong in a certain space. The other thing with these reverbs as well is what you're doing when you're adding reverb into a track is you're avoiding that very kind of programmed sound, if that makes any sense. You may have had this before where you've found your drums, you've put them all together, it feels like it should be working, you've meticulously placed everything on the beats that you want the drums to be hitting on, but it still feels kind of lifeless. It still feels very sort of mechanical and very much played. And reverb is a super important tool to avoid that happening, really. And what it does is it adds a little bit of noise effectively in between your hits, and that just creates a much more sort of naturalistic sound that really feels like it all belongs in one space. So let's just have a very quick listen to the way all that sits together with our punching kind of kick drum coming through. Anyway, that's it for this particular tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, I'd love a like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell as well, just so that you don't miss any updates. And also check out my website at mixingmasteringmentoring.com, where you'll find a whole bunch of other similar tutorials. And also you can find out more about my one-to-one mentoring sessions that I offer, as well as mixing and mastering services. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you on the next one.